Hi, guys, and welcome to another 7-minute lecture. So, what's going on in Iran? That's what we're looking at today. As most of you probably know, Iran is currently in the grip of large scale protests throughout the country. Even though there have been many protests in that country before, this is probably the largest one in a long time, probably since 2009. And it's over an issue that a lot of people thought would remain unchallenged in the country for a long period of time. So let me give you a brief overview of the situation in today's video. The current protests are known as the Masa Amini protests. They started in mid-September when a young girl called Masa Amini, or a young woman rather, she was 22, when she was killed under suspicious circumstances in Iranian police custody, namely the custody of the moral police in Iran. So, as you guys know, Iran is one of those countries where there's civilian law enforcement, like in any country, but then there's also the religious moral police, known as the guidance patrol, who essentially roam around the country with unchecked authority and arrest people for flouting all kinds of religious regulations. And as you know, one of those big regulations is that women must wear the hijab, the scarf. So this young woman was one of the many new generation Iranian women who have no time for this and who refuse to submit to the authority of the moral police. So she was in Tehran, the capital of Iran, to visit her brother, and she was arrested on the streets by the guidance patrol for not wearing a hijab on the road. 2 hours after she was arrested and taken away, just 2 hours, she was admitted to the hospital with a brain hemorrhage. She was in a coma for 2 days and passed away. This has now sparked such wide outrage in the country that almost the entire young generation is now out on the streets protesting. There's been widespread violence. About, I think, 20,000 people or so have been arrested. And it's really been a paradigm shift in many ways because of the issues that it's raised. The major impact of this is that in the last 4 months alone, more Iranian women have now abandoned the hijab in protest, and there are so many people doing it now that it's more or less impossible for the moral police to arrest them all. So remember the 20,000 figure I just gave you? Those are just the people protesting on the roads. This does not count the hundreds of thousands of Iranian women who are now refusing to wear the hijab. In fact, if you look at the media coverage, the television coverage from Iran, you can clearly see, even in the background, even behind the reporter with the mic, that most of the women casually walking around on the roads are not wearing the hijab. Some are surprised by this, but if you know the history of Iran, it shouldn't come as a huge surprise. Because until the late 70s, remember, Iran was one of the most secular Muslim countries in the world. Say whatever you will about what a tyrant the Shah of Iran was, but it was still a secular nation under him. It wasn't until the Khomeini revolution in 79, less than 45 years ago, that it became such a hardcore Islamic country. And it was only in the 1980s that the hijab law was actually passed. So the idea that some people have that Iranian culture in general is theocratic, that assumption is completely untrue. In fact, if you look at early Iranian history, it wasn't until the Safavid revolution of the 16th century that Iranian empires even started to adopt the hijab. And as recently as the 20th century, in the 1930s, for instance, the Shah of Iran's father, when he was the leader of the country, banned the hijab. So he went in the opposite direction. And this really goes to show how quickly things can change, right? Iran today is a theocratic country synonymous with the hijab, where women are forced to wear it. And yet, just 2 generations ago, it was a country where women were forced to not wear the hijab. Now, what's going to happen in the long run, the long term impact of all this? Unfortunately, there isn't much to be optimistic about because the government's claims of descaling or dismantling the religious police, that's been wishy-washy at best. The Attorney General of Iran has simply said, look, these regulations are under review and the moral police might be disbanded, but he did not say will. And we've got to remember that on this issue, the Iranian authorities have a long history of lying anyway. Even back in 1979, when Ayatollah Khomeini announced that a dress code had to be followed, there were widespread protests by thousands of women, and they were guaranteed that this dress code would simply be a suggestion or recommendation and not an actual law that they would be punished for flouting. When the protest then died down a year later in 1980, they just turned it into a mandatory law. And when they did that, they told the international community, look, this is just for Muslim women. This will not be applicable for minorities and foreigners. But 3 years later, they went back on that as well and made the hijab mandatory for any woman in Iran, even non Muslims and foreigners. So the Iranian government's word is essentially useless in this matter. The only slight hope for optimism is that culturally things have changed. As I stated earlier, if enough women simply continue to go about with their daily lives without a hijab, there's very little that a moral police can do, even if they continue to exist. And as of the last 4 months, that's what's happened, right? They haven't been able to flex their muscles. The moral police have not been able to showcase their strength because they know that even if they sneeze in the wrong direction right now, it would be bad news for them, given the scale of the protests. So ultimately, guys, the fate of Iran is now firmly in the hands of the youth of Iran. Whether the rest of us wish them the best or not, it's up to them to forge a path that works for them, right? I mean, they might want a religious police, they might want secularism, but ultimately, it's up to them. If you like content like this, please don't forget to share and subscribe. Thank you, take care, and I'll see you soon.